And good morning, everybody. Welcome back. And today I want to get another quick video in to kind of go over some updates I have with this PowerShell domain SOA check and basically the monitoring that I've added to it. So if you recall, in the last video, we had set up where we could do download of domains and set it up to check all of the domains. And I had the ability to go on and query IP control for the SOA. And in this particular version, I've enabled and also disabled recursion. So I want to go out and effectively say, query these two servers, but don't follow any kind of recursion up to an external root server or forwarding. So effectively what I then will have in this list, still by filtering and the ability to do this, is the ability now to select the items and to add those to a domain monitor. And this domain monitor then is going to allow me to set up a polling in seconds, or a polling monitor that's going to go through the list of all of the entries in this list view and then query these repeatedly for this period of time, until we stop it in the checkbox or the button. I also have it that if it sets up alerts, and this is I found in Windows 10 very applicable, and it pops up these notifications in the notification center. I'm going to have to go back and figure out Windows 8. That seems to be a little different. So I'm going to demonstrate it here on my test system in my lab. So really what I'm going to do then, I'm going to set up an aggressive polling threshold, and this is going to go out and every 10 seconds query the servers that I've defined in this list. So whatever's here, not based on the other screen. Querying these servers, so that means I can have different domains on different servers being checked at the same time in a different status, number one. Number two is this is pretty aggressive, so that if I were to go in and hit stop on the DNS server, this is going to check pretty quickly based on this threshold, and I should get almost instantaneously some messages when it hits that next, telling me that, hey, there's a message that just popped up and said, I can't ping that device, so check this device. It's no longer active or no longer responding. So here I sent that message for server whatever it is, and this in the case is server 1. There's a warning threshold on server 1 that won't repeat again until this time limit in minutes has expired. Okay, so number one, I've got some type of ability to control that alerting, but still allow it to keep alerting as you need to see it in case you're away from your desk or something else. And then again, as you see this, it goes back into the status. Now, I'm sure I will have some way to go back and say that if a status has been reached in error and then it's recovered again, to kind of close that warning off and to set up a message. I'll also put in some quiet mode and other full function capabilities here. So that was one of the things I added, and that works very well with this list. And doing things like changing serial number, let's say the serial number ever gets out of sync, you'll see now that I've got a message and it tells me the serial number is out of sync. And I can then see these messages in their entirety. And the other thing I added, because this is really the way to correct this in my lab, was to deploy all the files. So I do have some settings in my DNS server that flushes all these entries out every time I stop the server for dynamic entries, number one. Don't do this in production if you're doing dynamic DNS. Journals and things like that, they need to be maintained and controlled. So what I'm doing here is not what I'd recommend, but what I'm doing in my lab. It also demonstrates that there is an API that can deploy all of the DNS files to a tag of servers, such as your master servers, your slaves, things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that because this needs to happen. And this just puts in a task, let me know when it was submitted, and it'll sit in the background, the queue. Now this in the background is checking. Every so many seconds, 2-3 seconds, it goes out and pulls that task, looks for the complete status, and if it doesn't see it, kind of goes back into a sleep mode. But it does this a number of times, so it'll do it up to like 60 times so as not to continue doing this if it doesn't come back with complete. So it'll eventually give up, and again, that'll be something I think in the settings that I'll need to control. So you'll see here that it's actually deploying all these servers, so doing full pushes. Now the server is actually just restarting, and it's going to be coming back up. This poll will start again, and it's doing this with the other server and the masters too, which is .24. And then it's going to come up again and start monitoring once this is complete. And there you have it. So that push then forced all of those zones, and I now have a complete status, in this case here. And of course, I can take these out of the list as well if I no longer want them in here, or just maintain it. So this is going to run, and I have this set up to basically do this every 10 minutes. by default. That will change dynamically. The polling interval here, though, you'll need to stop and start to change this. And I should probably hard code that. So, there you have it. And that's, effectively what I had built in yesterday, which worked, again, very well. Now, a couple of things that I had concerns about, obviously, is performance. So the first thing I'm going to have to do, I guess, moving from here is go back and do the virtual list views. I don't like this list view and the refresh, and I really love virtual list views, which I discovered in VBNet. So having it store list view items in a variable and then loading a list view through that variable is much faster in terms of loading tens and thousands of different rows in these list views. So that's the first thing I want to do. The second thing I want to do when it comes to the monitor is I'm doing this basically sequentially. It goes in and checks all of these and then checks the status on each one. But I started looking at some ways of doing this through, basically what they have as jobs if you're doing this as PowerShell 3. But effectively in PowerShell 5, this is running the run space. So by allowing me to do run spaces, I can put all these tasks and commands for all of the different domains into a parallel task and then wait for the response for all of them to return before I report it back to the list view. So from a performance and a ticking perspective, that's going to greatly increase the performance there, I think. So here's kind of what that does. For those who are in the PowerShell development and haven't really looked into this yet, I created, a domain, basically. Here's the domains I want to query. And then I set up a function called query domains, which I'm going to run down here to go out and query these, setting them into a run space, and then resolving the answer and waiting until the answer is complete. So the first thing is, setting up our variable to pass it in. Here's our function. The session state goes out and sets up the initial session state, creating a default. Setting up the run space factory, which is going to set up then a run space pool, which you can tell the minimum and maximum. So this is the number of tasks or number of commands it's going to run in a single thread, basically, up to the number of threads being used. It'll wait until it starts completing and removing from the stack before it continues. So this is throttling effectively to help us do this. The PowerShell script function then is going to set up a new job for PowerShell, and it's going to add the run space, defining it to RP, and it's going to open that up. So this is very important to set the run space and then open it. And then what we're going to do here then is we're going to create a command list or array list that stores all the commands that are going to be passed into and run and then checked on. So we then go in and create another PowerShell function where we're going to run the run space. And then we're going to add to the run space an add script, which you have to basically set in a param, which we're going to pass in our domain, since we have to do this outside of the function. And then this resolve DNS then is going to effectively have all the values that we have in our functions. So it's going to silently continue on error, quick timeout. And what I'm doing is I'm just pulling back the answer. So for those of who are using this command, you basically have an answer, you have authority, you have an additional section for glue records and things. So you can extract different sections or all of them and then go back in and access those, through the list. So if you want to look at the answer, you can do that. If I want to look at authority, this should give me the name server records. And if I want to look at answer, this should give me whoever answered authoritatively for that, and then gives me the serial number and things of the zone. So that turned out to work very well too. So by doing that, you add it, and we're adding in the parameter then, since we have to do this again through this function, add a parameter domain, which is what's going to be listed here, and it's going to take the PS item, which we're creating, basically telling it that this is the command. Okay, so everything gets added, the domain gets added based on the PS item, which gets added to the domains, to the for each loop, and so on. So now we tell it to handle this and create a handle where it begins the invoke, puts it in the command queue, and then a few other things that, kind of reading up on here, but we're selecting basically the handle, looking for the different PowerShell and handle properties, and then we're adding those to the commands. And I'm then setting up a loop to walk through and saying, don't go any more than 30 attempts. It's doing this effectively 1 second, so that's 30-second delay if I need it. And it's going to go out and check the status count to make sure that, there's number count and the same commands, and that we haven't exceeded the temp, the loop count. Now, when it does this, each of these commands, when we run it, has a is completed true or false. So what I'm doing is just looping and waiting until all of these commands for all of the domain checks come back as true or false. Once that happens, I'll then have, in my list, the ability to go in and pull those back, which I then store in the results. So now once the results is stored, I then process these query results, which you can then tell it to go out and I'm creating an object which will output this and then disposing of this, capturing the errors, and so on. So really what's going to happen then when I run this is it's going to run in a different run space, go out and basically let everything query. And when it's complete, I'm going to get my results, which I'm going to process. So that's what I'm going to wrap this new command around, that every time it goes out to run this batch, if you will, it's going to create a task, and it's going to create all of these commands, and it's going to wait till all of them are done before it reports a status. And then I won't have to do a list view update every single second. I can just basically set it up to begin and end and do that. So that's that's where we're at today. And 2 days of working this, it's pretty good so far, I think. And then with the domain monitor, this turned out to be really good, and I'm going to go ahead and add those performance functions to this. I'm then going to move a lot of these parameters into their own settings, where again you can control each of the alerting types and wordings, and how frequent, the frequency of doing that. So, hey, thanks for bearing with me and checking back. Again, if there's anything you're interested in PowerShell, I'm learning this too as I go along and kind of building this out. But in terms of the PowerShell threading and other things, if you're, an expert at that, great, let me know, give me some insight. But if you're trying to use this and you have kind of the same thing I have, where you need to process things in the background, that's where I'm going with. So hopefully the next step we'll see some of that high performance and better checks and procedures there. So thanks for bearing with me, and join back again when I have some updates, and we'll see you soon. Take care.